Self-Allusive Meditation. Theory and Practice by Jacobo Grinberg, Zilberbaum, 1987. Preliminary Note by Bending Realities. Self-Allusive Meditation, written in 1987 by the renowned Mexican psychologist and neurophysiologist Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum, is a work that guides readers on an introspective journey towards self-awareness and self-knowledge. The book presents a meditation technique that allows individuals to observe their own mental processes and develop a deeper connection with their inner self. In a modern world characterized by constant noise and distraction, this practice is more relevant than ever, offering tools to find mental peace and clarity amidst the chaos. Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum, born in 1946 in Mexico City, dedicated his life to studying human consciousness. After studying psychology at UNAM and neurophysiology in New York, he returned to Mexico to research how indigenous spiritual traditions could enrich the scientific understanding of the mind. His pioneering work created a bridge between science and spirituality, developing concepts like the syntropic field, a theory aimed at explaining the connection between the mind and perceived reality. One of the most fascinating aspects of self-allusive meditation is that it is not only a practical meditation manual, but also a philosophical reflection on the nature of reality and perception. The author suggests that through self-observation, it is possible to alter how we experience the world, allowing for more direct access to the essence of consciousness. This idea is especially powerful today, as many people seek alternative methods to improve their emotional and spiritual well-being. An interesting fact is that the book was translated into English by the Bending Realities team, a group committed to bringing Grinberg's legacy to international audiences. The translation not only expands the reach of his teachings, but also highlights the growing demand for meditative and philosophical practices that transcend cultural boundaries. Self-Allusive Meditation is much more than a simple book on meditation. It is an invitation to explore the mysteries of the mind and discover the transformative power of consciousness. As global interest in contemplative practices grows, this work becomes an invaluable tool for those seeking a path to self-knowledge and spiritual expansion. Introduction. In his evolution, man has always looked for new ways of development and growth, which allow him to live with greater plenitude, happiness, and health. In this sense, in recent years, some meditation techniques have begun to spread, creating a growing movement of interest aimed at self-knowledge and expansion of consciousness. Unfortunately, most of these techniques are offered without a deep knowledge of their psychophysiological bases and surrounded by a superficial paraphernalia, linked to the need to belong to this or that school and depend on this or that teacher. The most unpleasant aspect of this movement is that some schools seem to mix an economic interest and sectarianism that distorts the true meaning of the development of the consciousness, which, to be effective, must free itself from mysteries, subterfuges, and petty interests, and instead focus on the achievement of unity through the expansion of consciousness. Originating from shamanic studies, the meditation technique presented here has undergone years of research, testing its basic postulates, its psychophysiological correlates, and its ability to stimulate a healthy and natural development of brain physiology and consciousness. For her, its practice does not represent any risk, does not require membership in any sect or lineage, and its teaching is open and without economic interests. In this book, self-allusive meditation is explained first in its theoretical basis and then in the practical procedures to activate it. Self-allusive meditation is a natural technique based on the normal processes of development and designed to stimulate the latter in a conscious, active way and in perfect accord with reality as it is. To the development of this technique, many efforts have concurred, in particular those of the National Institute for the Study of Consciousness, INPEC. It was precisely in the regional center of the state of Puebla, of INPEC, that several seminars explaining self-allusive meditation were held, which resulted in the motivation to write this book. Conocyte * collaborated by financing the research on Mexican autochthonous psychology, which served as the basis for this book. It is my greatest wish that this book will help to promote self-knowledge and consciousness. Part 1. Theory. Chapter 1. Algorithmization levels. It would seem that the human brain possesses a self-correcting and integrating mechanism. During development, more and more information is integrated into coherent and unified systems. The human being does not tolerate mental discomfort and confusion. Instead, he likes order, inner peace, and states of equilibrium. Since there is growth and the informational conditions and environmental complexity are constantly increasing, the brain states of equilibrium, in order to remain effective, must undergo periodic revision in order to integrate the new and preceding information into new and more expanded homeostatic states. An algorithm is a formula, pattern, or code that incorporates information into its structure. Mental homeostatic states are algorithmic states. These states of equilibrium are sustained by the achievement and activation of brain algorithms. For a brain to activate an algorithmic pattern, it must have the anatomical structure and the appropriate coding mechanisms in order to unify and integrate a large amount of data into a pattern that includes them. This inclusion is called self-allusive when the pattern manages to incorporate all the present brain information. There are many levels of inclusion, in such a way that one could think of the existence of a pyramid of consciousness, in which each of its layers incorporates information from the previous levels. The level of greatest pyramidal inclusion, the one that incorporates all the information of the system at a given instant, is the level of self-illusion. Self-illusion makes it possible to contemplate the common characteristic of a system. This common characteristic has been called in different ways, the essence of the system, its spirit or basic character. The more information is concentrated and integrated in the self-allusive algorithmic level, the more stable it is. Such stability means that the algorithmic pattern retains its structure, regardless of the modifications of the information from which it draws. There is a limit to self-allusive stability, that is, when the nourishing informational elements of an algorithm exceed a certain threshold of variation, the algorithm may not be able to maintain its structure and changes. This modification breaks the self-illusion equilibrium. This work argues that there is a directional axis of development, which functions as an attractive determinant of the system, leading it towards states of greater unification. When the self-allusive equilibrium is disturbed, the system must create a new pyramidal rung and a new level that will also be subject to self-illusion. When the system decays, the inclusive algorithm capable of integrating all the previous information, including that of the new level. Growth consists precisely in the search for new levels of integration and in the achievement of more powerful algorithms and self-allusive states of greater unification. The axis of development has a unitive directionality. Each new algorithmic level incorporates more information and therefore brings the whole system closer to unity. The living systems that have evolved have done so guided by this directional axis of unification. The emergence of the atom as an integrated set of particles, of the molecule as an integrated set of atoms, of the cell, the tissues, and the whole organism is an example of the above. nature's experimentation to create organic forms of ever greater complexity and unification was accelerated by the appearance of brain systems, which unify information and create algorithmic ensembles with a speed millions of times greater than that necessary for these ensembles to acquire a fixed organic sustenance. Neural software is ahead of bodily hardware, although both travel on the same track. It is not possible to achieve a state of satisfactory self-illusion unless the novel level of integration has been completed. That is, it is not possible to find the algorithm of a system unless it has experienced all the contingencies of its new state. This is why leaps in growth cannot be made. The drugs, for example, which in the psychedelic era activated leaps in algorithmic development, failed, because without them the brain systems returned to previous levels of development. The amotivational syndrome in the chronic drug addict arises as a consequence of the inability to sustain, in everyday life, the levels of experience provoked by drugs. On the other hand, if there were some technique that would stimulate development naturally, promoting unification, algorithmic creation, and self-illusion, this technique could satisfy the legitimate human yearning to be in a process of significant growth and tending to the achievement of contact with reality. This technique exists, and it is self-allusive meditation. Chapter 2: The Approach to Reality. Unification during algorithmic development is modeled on at least two brain processes: the creation of inclusive neural patterns and the development of neural fields of increased synergetics. Both processes are complementary, correlative to each other, and guided by the same developmental axis. The creation of highly inclusive neural patterns underpins language, conceptualization, and abstraction. The creation of neural fields of increased synergy is the foundation of the experience of unification. According to synergic theory, the brain creates a field of interactions capable of altering the structure of the space-time matrix. This alteration unifies brain activity with the rest of creation at different levels. Depending on the informational density of the neural field, its coherence and frequency, i.e., its synergia. The greater the synergia of the field, the greater the unification. In turn, the synergy of the neural field depends on the algorithmic power of the neural patterns of inclusion that the brain has managed to activate. There are different levels of consciousness, each of which depends on the synergic level of the neural field and the algorithmic power of the inclusion neural pattern. At each of these levels, real experiences are activated, but the reality from which they arise is that of total oneness. The experience of oneness is the experience of reality. This reality underlies all levels of consciousness and grounds the existence of any experience. An approach to reality is achieved as a greater amount of information is unified. This does not mean that the process is of an intellectual or theoretical type. Rather, informational unification, in order to provoke an approach to reality, must be authentically lived as an expansion of consciousness, in which identification with increasingly global aspects is strengthened and accentuated. We are accustomed to identify our personal identity with levels of realities that are not reality. We believe we are a body or a mind. We believe we are an idea or a theory. We believe we are our emotions. We believe we are a country or a flag. Identification with our body is the deepest and most pervasive identity. Along with it, we identify with our money, property, and possessions. Some of us believe we are our brain and think we would disappear if it were destroyed. In reality, we are reality itself and not one of its parts or portions. This reality is what gives life to our consciousness, independently of its contents. This reality is, at the same time, the basis of any of our experiences. One of the Eastern systems that comes closest to the study and practical activation of the experience of reality is Mahamudra. This Buddhist technique affirms that all the contents of the realities are reflected by the mirror of the mind, which is totally pure. The Mahamudra technique consists of experiencing this mirror independently of the content of its reflections. This implies not identifying oneself with the content of the experience, but with its origin, and this is closer to reality. In other words, the meditator of the Mahamudra technique learns to focus his attention on the common substratum of all experience, on its very origin, independently of its quality and content. This origin has its model in the highly coherent structure of the lattice of space. In fact, according to the synteric theory, since experience appears in the interaction of this matrix with the neural field, the substrate of any experience and its very origin is the pure and unaltered state of the lattice, prior to any interactive modification. It is this pure substrate that the meditator attends to during Mahamudra. However, this does not mean that what Buddhism calls the mirror of the mind is this lattice, also known as the quantum field. The latter is a physical model of something that, like consciousness, cannot be reduced to the material world. At the same time, it is necessary to remember that what we call the material world, the lattice, or matrix of space, is the very origin of space, its fundamental structure from which the elementary particles appear. And what we know as solid objects arises and represents a limited decoding of one of so many realities. The solidity and separateness is more a resultant of brain processing than a reality in itself. Even physics has already demonstrated the dual particle wave character of any object. The limits and boundaries that seem to separate one object from another are relative to the perceptual threshold. For a fine-tuned perception penetrating to the atomic level, the absolute substantiality, solidity, and separateness of the objects would disappear, giving rise to the image of a whole intertwined with, indeed, portions of greater and lesser density, complexity, coherence, and order of a common energetic organization. Such would be the perception for an eye and a brain functioning in a shorter than usual duration of the present. Returning to the Mahamudra technique, it is necessary to consider that the approach of its meditators to reality is not total, since even the experience of living any experience from its substratum can be observed. About this limitation I will speak later. In Buddhism too, the non-existence of object substantiality is recognized. In other words, the Buddhist affirms that no object, process, organism, or experience possesses absolute reality. Rather, everything is dependent and interwoven within a network of relationships. Therefore, the identification of a human being with something that possesses only a relative reality would condemn him to that very relativity. Now, if there were nothing capable of transcending the relative, the human condition and its consciousness would be condemned to live subjected to the random fluctuations of relative events in a world that is also relative, lacking in meaning, direction, and source. Self-Allusive Meditation considers that even that world could be observed, so that the observer must belong to a reality that transcends the relative, that is to say, that he belongs to reality. Chapter 3: The Self-Allusive Experience. The self-allusive experience, that is, the observation of the totality of oneself in the present moment, is not a passive experience, especially when the self-illusion is of the limitless type. In other words, when the resultant of self-illusion is subjected to observation and so on in a constant and continuous process. Unbounded self-illusion can be continued until the algorithmic capacity of the system is exceeded. At that point, the system must acquire new information and integrate it until a novel algorithm that can be subjected to self-illusion is decanted. The self-illusive experience is an experience of unification that receives, therefore, the same vitalizing energy that has guided the evolutionary process. Therefore, this experience, rather than passive, is ecstatic, and rather than equanimous, is one of grace. From a psychophysiological point of view, the self-illusive experience is explained in the same way that any sensory experience is explained, that is, as the result of an interaction between the neuronal field and the quantum field. But since self-illusion increases the informational density, coherence, and syntaggy of the neural field, it is able to establish a congruent interaction with a level of the lattice very close to the very origin of the quantum field. Because of this, the resulting experience is what Buddhism calls nirvana, what Sufism calls fanya, and what could be expressed as pure consciousness or pure self. On the other hand, although the experience of the egoic presence can arise in any zone of the interaction of fields, there are preferably three main locations for its appearance. These are, in the interior of the neuronal field, in the zone itself, or edge of the interaction of fields, and in the quantum field. Intraneuronal activation is a corporeal location. Activation at the edge of the interaction is a location of the egoic experience in the experience itself, while quantum activation is an extracorporeal location. Since I have already analyzed in detail some aspects of these three localizations *, here I will only mention that the quantum position brings as a consequence the activation of the double and a capacity to modify physical aspects of reality. Returning to the limitless self-illusion, I said before that it can be continued up to the point at which the system cannot find its own algorithm. Generally, at that moment, the location of the egoic experience varies from one extracorporeal position to another at the edge of the interaction, and the subject ceases to be an observer of his experience in order to identify with it. When this identification takes place in zones of high syntergia, the resulting experience is one of ecstasy and spiritual joy. When the previous state is successfully algorithmized, and thus self-alluded to, the system completes a new level of development and begins, once again, its process of development towards further unification. For her, self-allusive meditation is a highly active, living, and vital technique. Self-allusive meditation increases awareness, strengthens action, and does not require confinement, silence, or even isolation to progress. It is a totally natural procedure that allows one to be in the world, but not of the world. That is to say, for the self-allusive meditator, there is no longer identification with the world, but his experience of it persists. He does not deny the existence of the world. He transcends it, locating himself closer to the observer and to reality than to any reality. The capacity for self-illusion does not admit limits or goals. However, in order to progress, it requires willpower and personal power, and the latter, in order to exist, does not admit useless distractions or ephemeral pleasures. In this sense, self-allusive meditation resembles Zen, which rejects the idea of the existence of a final goal, considering it as childish and illusory. Reality is always present for whoever is able to perceive it. The preparation to perceive it can lead to the goal of establishing contact with it. But this goal does not imply that reality exists in some future to come, and that it does not exist now and here. Reality is always present. It is our possibility to be in it, or to identify ourselves with some concrete aspect of it. This ultimate identification, being temporary and finite, has death as its destiny. In exchange, the observer and reality survive. One of the Buddhist techniques most similar to self-allusive meditation, Vipassana, teaches its practitioners the art of observing, leading even the most talented to the possibility of observing the process of their own bodily death, presumably surviving it. Self-illusion is not analytical observation, nor should it be confused with what might be termed super-egoic observation, in which the internalized cultural portion of the personality judges one's own behavior, one's own judgments and thoughts from a platform of critical analysis. Self-illusion is direct and does not require mental or cultural intermediaries. Moreover, these intermediaries are part of the observational content that will ultimately be self-alluding when integrated into an inclusive algorithm. For the above, the observer is not the Freudian superego, nor is it a zone or level of the mind, as Buddhism mistakenly maintains. The observer is the guide of the process, and like reality, is always present witnessing the contents of the mind. Chapter 4: The Shared Mind. The mind is shared and not private. The thoughts and state of consciousness of one subject are communicated directly to other subjects. The mind, in fact, is part of the same interaction of fields from which sensory experience arises. Therefore, the content of the mind is inscribed in the same lattice of the quantum field, of which all neural fields are part. When one alludes to oneself, one inevitably observes contents that belong to other minds with which one maintains relations. At a certain level of self-illusion, the personal ego is diluted, and the only thing that persists is the act of observation, transcending the conditioned personality. It is not a disappearance of individuality, but rather its expansion. The act of observation incorporates the same hyperfield nourished by the neural fields of more and more beings. In reality, the shared mind is the same mind from which the individual emerges. Its basic substance, the quantum field, admits no owners, and thus any path whose direction approaches the unity must be confronted with the existence of it. In that instance, there are at least two possibilities of choice. On the one hand, the acceptance of one's own identity as capable of including the whole, or the rejection of the other, considering it as essentially foreign to the one. In the first case, the path leads to the disappearance of the ego and to unity. In the second, separation and isolation are activated. In self-allusive meditation, it is essential to learn to accept. Any content of the self, regardless of its origin, is part of the consciousness and this of the unity, which is intended to live. For her, self-illusion without acceptance is impossible. From another point of view, algorithmization only proceeds when information is accepted. If certain contents are rejected and others are accepted, the algorithm that will be decanted will be, at best, partial and incomplete, and a self-illusion of the totality will not be able to prosper. Acceptance, however, implies neither identification nor conformism. It is accepted in order to transcend and to transform, not to limit and identify. The goal of self-illusion is to reach one's own self, that which includes everything, but is not identified with anything, that which can observe everything, but cannot be encompassed by any mental, analytical, or intellectual scheme. On one occasion, Sri Aurobindo said that reality was like a clean and unobstructed sky, through which thoughts pass as if they were birds. They travel from one end of the sky to the other without leaving a trace, without disturbing the balance of empty space, without fouling the atmosphere. Self-illusion requires acceptance to allow the contents to flow without blockages, without creating tensions, so that identification with any of them does not flourish, to keep the reality of heaven free of dirt. Self-illusion is only a technique that allows an approach to reality. It is never an end in itself. The goal of self-allusive meditation is reality, but reality cannot be described or explained. When the contents of any experience are accepted while maintaining the attitude of observation and self-illusion without limits, contact with reality is established. Chapter 5: Reality. There is no body, and no mind, and nothing to self-illude. There are no thoughts to disturb the state of pure existence without limits. Everything is part of the same. There are no sections or levels, only peace and existence. Everything vibrates and is vital. Everything produces love and belongs to the same being, and it is me and I am it. It is constantly being created, but there is no separation between creator and creation, and all is one. The arrival at reality is unmistakable. There are no doubts, no analytical considerations, no questioning. It is simply there, although it cannot be located anywhere. In reality, everything is unified, but the existence that is experienced cannot be reduced to unity. It is beyond it, and at the same time it is in it. It exists, it simply exists. It is, moreover, totally natural and simultaneously totally astonishing. There is no unconsciousness, no matter, no separate objects or persons in it. They are all the same being, and it is one, but it is not amorphous. It exists in total balance and love. It exists in peace and beyond thought. It is reality. Part 2: Practice. Chapter 6: Strengthening of Attention, Anapana. The practice of self-allusive meditation is based on observation, and this, to be effective, implies the strengthening of attention. In order to consider that attention is the fundamental tool, this chapter is dedicated to its management and strengthening. Any object or activity can be used to strengthen attention, but among all, the body itself and respiratory movements are the most appropriate. Buddhism calls the maintenance of attention in the latter Anapana. In all mindfulness exercises, the natural limits of the system should be respected. It is suggested to use cycles of approximately 20 minutes, increasing the duration of the exercise gradually. In a quiet place, free of insects and well ventilated, it is advisable to sit comfortably, preferably with loose clothing and with a semi-empty stomach. Once seated, close your eyes and pay attention to the entry and exit of air from your own lungs, without forcing it and trying to make the breathing rhythm natural and calm. For a few minutes, the practitioner will attend to his breathing, trying to feel, each time in greater detail, the passage of air inside the nose, the filling and emptying of the lungs, the associated temperature changes, the accompanying body sensations, the position of his back, and so on. The goal of this first exercise is to maintain attention without deviations and without losing detail of the breathing process for 20 minutes. To achieve this, it is necessary to practice several times a day, increasing the duration of the exercise each time. When this has been achieved, it is advisable to extend the periods and practice the exercise with eyes open and in the midst of daily activities. In other words, it is intended that attention is maintained during daily life and not only in special periods. Other mindfulness exercises during daily life are sustained observation of one's own body. The practitioner is recommended to maintain attention on his or her body, observing and feeling the different postures it adopts in different circumstances, when walking, sitting, standing, and lying down. The longer the duration of the period during which the practitioner is able to pay attention to his own body, the easier it will be to activate the self-allusive meditation. Another attention exercise that is advisable is the perception of the shape, colors, and textural details of objects, without judging or analyzing their meaning, importance, usefulness, or denomination. This exercise strengthens the capacity to pay attention directly and without intellectual mediation. In addition to the above, this exercise allows a fresh and vital access to perceptual reality. The practitioner should use these exercises daily and for as long as possible. Ideally, she should sustain his/her attention without interruptions or deviations throughout the day, alternating between focusing on the breath, body postures, and objects. Chapter 7. Observation of the Body, Vipassana. This is a Buddhist technique that is currently practiced in countries such as India, Sri Lanka, etc. One of the variants practiced in Burma, according to an old tradition revived by S.M. Goenka, is the one presented in this chapter. When the practitioner has managed to strengthen his attention, according to the instructions of the last chapter, until he is able to keep it focused for a minimum of 20 minutes, without dispersions or deviations, he will be able to practice Vipassana. In this technique, the practitioner learns to feel his body, first part by part, and later in its totality. It is enough to experience it as a unit. It is recommended that the practitioner of Vipassana exercises in this technique in the same clean, ventilated, and insect-free place in which he practices his Anapana, and as a continuation of it. In other words, the practitioner will sit comfortably, close his eyes, and begin to concentrate his attention on his breathing movements until he manages to keep it fixed and without deviations. This is the preparation for Vipassana. Once this is achieved, and in the same posture and situation, the practitioner directs his attention to the top of his head and keeps it there until he feels some sensation in that area. The sensation can be tactile, vibratory, tingling, temperature, or any other type of sensation. Once this is achieved, the practitioner attends to the sensations that exist around the vertex. It is enough to go all around the top of the head. Using the same technique, the forehead, the nape of the neck, the ears, the cheeks, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and the neck, until completing the whole head without leaving any area untraveled and unfeel. The quality of the sensation does not matter. The important thing is that no blind zones are left. When one of these is found, attention should be kept on it until some sensation, whatever it may be, is awakened. According to Goenka, sensations of pain should be observed with the same equanimity and detachment as those of pleasure. Once the head has been recognized, the same technique is practiced with men: arms, hands, back, chest, belly, hips, buttocks, genital organs, thighs, legs, feet, and fingers, until the whole body is covered. The path is repeated over and over again, activating blind spots and observing all the sensations that occur with detachment and equanimity. Little by little, we try to feel the unity of the body until we observe and feel the body as a complete unit. Goenka, 1984. Personal communication. One of the ways to achieve the above is to unify parts that have already been traversed. For example, after observing all the parts of the head, this is observed as a unit without simultaneously losing the observation of all its parts. Then the same is done with the whole back after having gone through all its parts. The unity of the head and the back are unified, perceiving them as complete and simultaneous in a new act of observation. Little by little, all the parts are unified, without losing any detail of them, until the unified and simultaneous observation of each and every one of them is achieved. In reality, what we are doing is activating and decanting algorithms that become more and more inclusive until the algorithm of unification of the whole body image is activated, which is observed. The observation of the bodily unity must be able to be maintained in daily life. In addition to this Vipassana of the body surface, it is also necessary to observe the internal organs. For this, after going over the entire surface of the body, one proceeds to focus the attention on the interior, starting with the head region. A practical procedure to do this is to place the attention in a circle perpendicular to the body axis. The entire surface of the circle is traversed, first in the highest area of the skull, and little by little it is made to penetrate through the brain, maintaining the observation of its entire surface. The circle is then gradually lowered down through the whole body. Another procedure consists of penetrating a few millimeters at a time in each area of observation of the surface, in each tour of the entire surface. In each tour, attention is paid to the sensations located deeper, until the entire interior of the body is covered. The body unification algorithm, to be complete, must include both the surface and the interior of the body. Vipassana, besides preparing the aspirant for self-allusive meditation, has an immediate effect of deep body cleansing, healing and prevention of ailments, pains, and diseases. Above all, it strengthens the capacity for observation, attention, and awareness by awakening the dormant sensations of the blind zones. Buddhism considers these zones of ignorance, so their revival means to eliminate this ignorance, thus expanding the consciousness. With this preparation, we are ready to perform the next step, the observation of the mind. Chapter 8. Observation of the mind. The mind does not exist as a concrete and independent entity, nor as a delimited object separated from other objects. In speaking of the mind, reference is not made to the existence of a materialized mass possessing sensible attributes such as color, shape, texture, or location somewhere in space. Rather, it refers to a dynamic process that manifests itself in the form of thoughts, memories, and images. For her, the observation of the mind is the observation of the contents of the mind. In the context of self-allusive meditation, the observation of the contents of the mind is performed until the subject of experience is able to observe the origin, maintenance, and disappearance of any thought, memory, or image without identifying with them, i.e., until the subject of experience becomes the observer of the mind. The best way to achieve this is to adopt the same meditation posture as in Anapana and Vipassana, but attending to the observer. When detached observation of spontaneous mental contents is achieved, the next step is to voluntarily activate a thought or image by observing its origin, maintenance, and disappearance without identifying with them, as if they were external objects. The detailed procedure to achieve all of the above will be described in the following sections. Observation of spontaneous thoughts. Sitting comfortably and with the back straight, do Anapana and then Vipassana until the observation of the bodily unit is achieved using the same procedure described earlier in this book. Once this is achieved, the attention is directed towards any thought that arises spontaneously. The content of the thought can vary to an infinite degree of possibilities. It may be about the meaning of what is being done, about accomplishments, about some memory, concerning some plan, or in relation to some novel idea, and so on. In any case, the thought is allowed to flow without value judgments and without blockages. In case a judgment appears, it is also observed without repressing it. The mind is simply allowed to choose any course it wishes as long as it observes the developments and derivations without identifying itself with them. If no spontaneous thought appears, then a tour of the sensations in the different bodily zones is made, paying attention to any thought that might appear when one or more points of the surface or the interior of the body are activated. As the trajectories are repeated according to the content of the thought, the emergence of the thought can be observed with greater clarity and detail. The same will be true of its maintenance, development, and disappearance. It does not matter how interesting, valuable, or significant a thought may be. In all cases, it is observed as such without identifying with it, and independently of its content. Observation of provoked thoughts. Once the above has been achieved, and with the mind calm, a thought is provoked. In the same way as before, it is observed attending to its appearance, development, and disappearance, observing it as a thought without identifying with its content. The process is continued until any thought is made to appear at will by observing it as if it were an external object. The important thing in the process is to achieve that the identification of the subject of the experience with the contents of the experience is transferred to the identification with the observer, who remains equanimous and faithful to his own nature, no matter what contents of the experience appear. Observation of memories. Every point and area of the body contains memories. Vipassanic attention causes these memories to be evoked. The observer exists independent of the contents of his observation. The detached observation of spontaneous or provoked thoughts and memories activates the unification of the totality of mental contents in the oneness of the observer. The described procedure will allow the subject of the experience to know better his personal history and to understand the origin of his conditioning. Until this real knowledge is achieved, the experience of reality will oscillate between identification with the contents of the mind and localization in the observer as such. The process of traversing the contents of the mind and the emergence of memories has several stages in which each time a master schema or pattern will appear with increasing clarity as a subtext of the whole personal history. When this schema appears, it should also be subject to observation without being identified with it. This will make it possible to achieve a kind of leap in which the meditator will approach his true nature as the reality and the observer and not as the subject of the experience, although in reality both are the same. Simultaneous observation of thoughts. The spontaneous or provoked appearance of thoughts may or may not be linear. Even several thoughts may appear together in sequence or in absence of sequence. In all cases, they are thoughts that must be observed as such without identifications with their contents. It may happen that a thought about the nature of mind appears simultaneously with a judgment about some event in personal history. The meditator should be able to observe any of the contents of the thought, regardless of their greatness or vileness, as mere thoughts without identifying with them. Even the thought of not identifying with them should be observed as a thought. The mind has been conceptualized as a lake and thoughts as the waves of the lake. The observer's position allows one to observe the lake and its waves from a witnessing perspective without identifying with them. In order to be able to observe the whole content of the mind, it will be necessary to strengthen the attention from the observation of isolated thoughts and then proceed to the simultaneous observation of more and more thoughts, unifying them as what they are, different contents of the same unity of which the observer is the detached witness. For this, the meditator will voluntarily activate several simultaneous thoughts by observing them all at the same time in the same way as he proceeded to observe the bodily unit after attending to each of its parts. The unification of thoughts can be done gradually one by one and later on, attending to several simultaneously, until acquiring the unified mastery of observer of all. The same procedure of observation of thoughts will be applied for any other content of the mind, especially for the internal images that arise from it. The technique of image activation will be explained below. Image observation. The observation of internal images can be done before, after, or simultaneously with the observation of thoughts, memories, or any other content of the mind. The best way to see an internal image is to locate some point or illuminated area within the dark panorama that appears when closing the eyes. When one of these points is located, the meditator should concentrate all his attention on it, waiting for its structure to begin to unfold before the mind's eye until it appears as an inner image. The brain is continuously active. Billions of neural processes are occurring at every instant. Whether these processes manifest as images, thoughts, or in any other form depends on factors such as personal history, genetic makeup, and training. For the meditator interested in the reality of the observer and not in identification with its contents, the specific quality of these is secondary. Training in the observation of the inner images allows them to be seen as contained in the oneness of the observer and not as elements of identification. When it is possible to maintain the attention on some luminous point of the internal visual field, the attended point will be transformed into an internal image, which can be observed by perceiving its emergence, maintenance, evolution, and disappearance as if it were a thought. For those whose internal images arise spontaneously, the process of observing them is similar to that of the observation provoked from a luminous point. In both cases, they will be attended to by observing their emergence, development, and disappearance, remembering that they are contents of the mind and without identifying with them. The observation can continue until the meditator manages to observe several simultaneous or sequential images without losing his posture as an observer of them. Simultaneous observation of images, memories, and thoughts. Finally, we will proceed to make a free and simultaneous observation of any content of the mind, independently of its quality and characteristics, remaining as a witness of them until achieving an observation of the unity of the thought and image and of any other content of the mind. Chapter 9. The Observation of Emotions. We only need 2 more steps to be able to describe the technique of self-allusive meditation, which are the observation of the emotional components of our psyche, whether we call these feelings or simply emotions, and the observation of patterns. The latter will be discussed in the next chapter. The observation of emotions is difficult because we almost always identify ourselves with our emotional states, making a detached observation of them a challenge. This is similar to what happens with our social role. It is relatively easy to identify with it, especially because society constantly imposes this identification on us. But just as the social role is a game and never our real identity, so our emotions can be observed from an equanimous platform, detached and unidentified with its contents of observation. From this platform, emotions and thoughts are seen to pass by as if they were passing by themselves. Alan Watts describes it very well when he says, "It feels as if everything is me, or as if everything, including my own thoughts and actions, is happening all by itself." A practical way to observe emotions is to contemplate their bodily effects on a one-to-one basis. In other words, to do bodily Vipassana during emotional activation. This dissected observation enables one to make an equanimous and detached observation of the emotion itself. It is advisable to dissect the bodily effects and observe the unified emotion simultaneously. For this, it is suggested to capture the instant in which an emotion begins, observing immediately the bodily changes that accompany it. These may consist of alterations in the heart rate, modifications in the depth and frequency of breathing, movements and sensations in the stomach and intestines, changes in muscular tension, etc. It is advisable to make a bodily tour observing all the changes that accompany the emotion. this observation should be done without judgment or criticism, but rather in an equanimous neutral state. After the above and in successive steps, it is advisable to join the sensations until a unified observation of all the bodily alterations during the emotion is achieved. Once this has been done, a direct observation of the emotion as a feeling in itself can be attempted without dissections or partial observations. Finally, it is advisable to attempt a simultaneous observation of the emotion itself and of the bodily components that accompany it. As one exercises direct emotional observation and contemplation of the bodily components of the emotion, one will acquire mastery in this exercise, which results in emotional fluency without repression and equanimous observation of the emotion without identifications. At the same time, this technique results in emotional cleansing and the ability to remain unified without losing center during emotional processes. It is convenient to learn to identify the different emotions and discover their dynamics, causes, and triggering stimuli. The knowledge of our emotional being, its processes and conditioning, leads to a healthier and more fluid life. The sustained observation of emotional changes and the discovery of their dynamics helps us to be masters of ourselves on a much more total and deeper level than usual. Little by little, and as it is exercised more, emotional observation leads to the achievement of a state of greater power and equanimity, in which emotions enrich personal life without causing confusion or intense suffering, but accompanying the experiences, giving them meaning and life. It is not a matter of making emotions disappear, but rather of enriching them by giving them the place they deserve and preventing them from controlling or confusing us. Although acceptance is indispensable to succeed in the observation of any experience, for the contemplation of emotions is a sine qua non requirement. Emotional states must be accepted in order to be observed as they really are. Emotional repression or fear to face any emotional state will make any attempt to meditate self-allusively fail. On the other hand, learning to accept emotional states will guarantee the success of meditation, since any attempt to algorithmize requires truthful information, and this can only be obtained by accepting it. Chapter 10: The Observation of Patterns. Once all of the above has been accomplished, there is only one more step to begin the practice of self-talk meditation. Since this technique implies the capacity for algorithmization, the practice of self-illusion is strengthened if algorithmic exercises are performed prior to its implementation. These exercises will be described in this chapter and consist of pattern observation. Nature offers a multitude of forms sustained by patterns, from the leaf of a tree with the arrangement of its lines to the regular waves of sand dunes and the whitish patterns of clouds. The observation of patterns consists in paying sustained attention to any object, trying to discover among its forms some regular arrangement that constitutes a pattern. One could begin the exercise by attentively observing a flower or a tree leaf. The longer the time of sustained observation and the more patterns you can discover, the better. Plant forms can be observed with the naked eye or with the help of magnifying glasses or microscopes, depending on the facilities available and one's own interest. Each time a pattern is identified, an algorithm is activated. Algorithmic development occurs when patterns that increase in complexity are identified. Thus, once the pattern of a leaf or the regular arrangement of the parts of a flower has been observed at length, and with a certain amount of time, it is recommended to proceed with more complex arrangements, such as the shapes of clouds, the surfaces of lakes or the sea, the shapes of rocks, etc. The observation of flames and their shapes represents an excellent practice, especially when one can perceive patterns from their movements and complex morphologies. The observation of dynamic and changing patterns strengthens the natural algorithmic decoding capacity of the living system interacting with the environment. One of the observation practices most used by shamans is the contemplation of the starry sky. Recognizing star patterns is widely recommended as a preparation for self-allusive meditation. Chapter 11. Self-Allusive Meditation. Having done all the above, we are ready for the practice of self-allusive meditation. It is suggested to the meditator to sit comfortably in the place he has chosen for all the previous practices, or in any other quiet, ventilated, and insect-free place. With the eyes closed and the back straight, the self-allusive meditation begins by strengthening the attention, concentrating on the entrance and exit of air into the lungs during breathing. This should be rhythmic, slow, and calm. This practice of Anapana is continued until the attention remains fixed on the respiratory movements and on the sensations provoked by the air passing through the nostrils and penetrating the organism. Then, when it leaves the body, paying attention to all the details of the process. Once the attention has been strengthened, and without any distractions of a single respiratory movement for a few minutes, the attention is taken to the vertex or top of the head to feel there the bodily sensations that exist at that point, and from there, start to go through the body in the practice of Vipassana. Both during Anapana and Vipassana, the thoughts that may arise during the practice are neither repressed nor diverted. They are simply allowed to occur freely, observing them with placidity, equanimity, and without identifying with them. The bodily Vipassanic path is continued until there are no blind spots in any area of the body. When you reach this point and you can go through the whole body without blockages, you proceed to link the breath with the path in the following way. When you breathe in, you go through the body from the feet to the head, and when you breathe out, you go through the body in the opposite direction. This upward and downward movement in a breathing rhythm continues until you begin to feel the whole body as a unit. At that moment, the dynamic path is interrupted and the whole body is observed as a unit. An intermediate practice that helps to achieve this observation of the body's unity is to unify the body part by part during the initial movement. When the body is observed as a unit, the simultaneous contemplation of the respiratory movements is added to this observation until the body and the breath form a new unit of observation. Once this is achieved, we proceed to the observation of the contents of the mind. For this, momentarily the observation of the body and breathing is interrupted, and the attention is directed towards the mind, observing its contents. One observes the thoughts with equanimity, without identifying with them, until one is able to contemplate how they originate, develop, and fade away. This practice is continued until all the mental contents susceptible of being observed and their origin in the luminous mirror of the mind are perceived. When this is achieved, then the observation of the mind is added to the observation of the unified body and the breath, achieving a new unity of body, mind, and respiratory movements. After the above, the attention is focused on the emotions momentarily, abandoning the observation of the unity of body, mind, and breath. Emotions are first observed as such without dissecting their visceral and vegetative components, and then paying attention to the accompanying bodily changes. Any emotion that arises spontaneously is observed with equanimity, without judgment, analysis, or qualification. In the same way in which any thought is allowed to flow without repression or deviations, emotions are allowed to flow until they are observed together with all their bodily changes without identifying with them and these. Once this is achieved, the emotions, their bodily changes, the mind and its thoughts, the body and the breath are simultaneously observed in a new unity that incorporates them all. This observation of the unity of all the components of experience that can be contemplated is called observation of the totality of oneself in the present. Obviously, this observation of the totality is not of the totality of the whole universe, but only of that which is possible to realize in the present. The observation of the totality of oneself in the present is the self-allusive meditation in its components. The next step in the technique is to observe the resultant of the union of all the elements of oneself in the sense of selfhood or selfhood. As in the observation of the emotions as such, and the dissected observation of the bodily, visceral, and vegetative components that accompany them, the self-allusive contemplation of oneself consists in the dissected observation of all the components of the experience that can be observed and the observation of the unified resultant. It is recommended that the meditator achieve mastery in the observation of the components before attempting the observation of the unified self. When the observation of the unified self can be done directly, it is advisable, from time to time, to make a careful review of the components of the experience by observing them in order to correct and enrich the algorithms of inclusion resulting from the unification. Self-allusive meditation can be strengthened by practicing it during daily life without the need for special schedules or secluded places, incorporating in the observation not only the components I have indicated, but also the sensory elements and the visual and auditory precepts. Self-allusive meditation that incorporates the visual and auditory world in the observation of the unity brings the meditator closer to the observation of reality, which is the true objective and goal of self-allusive meditation. In contemporary physics, the algorithm that succeeds in describing a very complex dynamical system is called a strange attractor. If we assume that strange attractors exist in the brain, they could be considered as the guides of the system during the self-allusive process. Imagine one of those moments when the name of a person is momentarily forgotten, and when one wants to remember it, one has the feeling that the forgotten name is, so to speak, on the tip of one's tongue. Somehow, for the consciousness in search of the name, the sensation and the search seem to be guided precisely by a strange attractor. The search ends, and the system reaches its equilibrium when the strange attractor becomes the algorithm of the remembered name. Something similar happens in self-allusive meditation, in which one must suppose the existence of a guide or strange attractor that literally attracts the system towards the algorithmic decoding, not of a name, but of the total and real state of the subject in a given present. If this attractive guide does not exist, self-illusion will not be possible. It is as if the system contains its future state of development in the present and attracts itself to it. Since the state that is activated by self-allusive meditation is that of contact with reality, and reality always exists, the strange attractor that guides self-illusion is this omnipresent, all-embracing, all-wise reality. This reality is that of the observer. In esoteric Christianity, the observer is represented as an eye inside a triangle. The triangle represents the Christian trilogy, and the watcher eye is that which unifies the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The secret of the Christian trilogy and what unifies it is the watcher. Many of the shamanic lineages of Mexico have incorporated this symbol and revere it deeply. In Hinduism, there is also a trilogy, that of Krishna, Vishnu, and Shiva, the creator, the sustainer, and the destroyer. This trilogy is contained in the self, Purusha, Atman, which is untouchable and remains unchanging regardless of the changes that the universe undergoes. That is, it occupies a place similar to that of the observer. In India, it is said that the self is not burned by fire, it is not wet by water, and no weapon can hurt it. The goal of self-allusive meditation is precisely the encounter with the reality of the observer and the self, through the algorithmic activation of increased inclusive power. As we have seen, this technique consists of observing the totality of oneself in the present. This totality is the unity of all the processes that coexist in a given instant. With constant practice, this observation of the totality of oneself is achieved effortlessly. Self-illusion is the observation of the characteristic state from a perspective free of identifications. It is a seeing oneself from a transcendent and simultaneously neutral posture. In this seeing oneself, the subject approaches oneself free of content because the observation is not intellectual or even logical, but rather direct and total. As we have already seen, in order to achieve unification, one proceeds little by uniting various aspects. First of all, the bodily sensations, then the thoughts and emotions. In other words, first we proceed with the technique of Anapana and Vipassana until we achieve the unification of the body image. Then we proceed to do the same with the thoughts and ideas, until all the emotional components of the present are incorporated into the same unit. The unification of all the experiences into one produces the sensation of identity, of the totality of oneself in the present. This ego sensation is the content of the self-illusion in which the self of the present proceeds to observe. With practice, the gradual unification of all spheres of experiences becomes unnecessary because the meditator becomes able to identify his selfhood and observe it directly. Chapter 11. The Permanent and Unlimited Self-Allusive Meditation. When self-illusion is achieved without intermediate sequences, the next step in the practice is to maintain the self-allusive observation in a permanent way. For this, it is necessary to strengthen the focused attention that prevents distraction and maintains the observation during daily life. Self-allusive meditation should not be confused with analytical contemplation or activation of critical thinking and judgment. The permanent self-allusive meditator always remembers who he is and remains alert and avoids identifying with the contents of his experience. He simply observes himself in self-alluding. When he succeeds in self-alluding, the experience of selfhood is transformed. In contemporary physics, it is known that the observer participates and modifies his objects of observation. In the same way, the subject who observes the totality of himself in the present transforms this totality, since he incorporates in it the new element of his self-illusion. The new totality of the self thus obtained can be observed again by self-alluding it. This new self-illusion modifies the totality again, and so on. When self-allusive meditation continues in this dynamic process of sustained self-illusion, it is called limitless. Permanent limitless self-allusive meditation can be continued until such time as the system fails to unify into a new sense of selfhood that can be algorithmized and therefore observed and self-illuded. The algorithmization of the totality of the present is the sensation of egoic selfhood. 2 or 3 self-illusions of transformed selfhood can bring the system to such a high informational density that the decanting of its algorithm needs a relatively long time to be achieved. If during this algorithmic search the observation is maintained, sooner or later the subject will be able to unify into a sensation of selfhood susceptible of being observed. There comes a moment in which the permanent self-allusive meditation without limits leads the subject to place himself in his own identity in unity with the rest. In conclusion, permanent and limitless self-allusive meditation is the capacity to observe the totality of oneself at all times without identifications with any of its contents, maintaining and remembering reality. Chapter 12. Final Considerations. There is no limit to observation, even in those instances in which it is not possible to self-alludiate. This inability can be observed. It is possible to observe one's own confusion and contemplate one's own forgetfulness. Even in the moments of maximum emptiness or deep depression, the observer remains. The capacity to remember that can always be observed is the capacity to maintain a state of optimism, faith and hope in life and its meaning. No matter how terrible a mental suffering may be, no matter how deep the confusion, displeasure, or grief may become, the observer remains pure, untouched, and totally self-sufficient in its capacity. The existence of the observer is the foundation of true faith. The last consideration I venture to suggest before concluding this book is the recommendation to remember that one can observe. The strengthening of this memory and its application at all times will ensure that any human being becomes more and more self-possessed, optimistic, and aware that there is always a next step. Appendix. The Observer and the Lattice. One of the most interesting aspects of the lattice conception is its great similarity with the properties of the observer. Both the observer and the lattice are a singularity, and both are non-dependent constructs from which diverse manifestations are generated in infinite number. Regardless of the appearance of any elementary particle and all chemical compounds and objects of the universe, the lattice is preserved as a unique and singular support. Similarly, the observer is unique and singular regardless of the contents of his experience. According to these analogies, one might think that what we call lattice is the observer itself. This would be in accordance with the observer's experience of identity with the subject of experience when the latter's brain and its neural field reach high coherence. In a state of high coherence, the neural field mimics the fundamental state of the lattice, so that the identity between lattice and observer is also grounded from a physiological, physical, and phenomenological point of view. According to these considerations, the fundamental state is the active silence of the observer and never the absence of consciousness in a hypothetical passive nothingness. The state of silence so longed for by the seekers of the essential state of being is not then the absence of consciousness of an absolute mental void, but the self-sufficient and vital consciousness of the pure self and of reality. Finally, despite all the above analogies, there is evidence to suggest that the observer cannot be reduced to the lattice, nor that the lattice itself is the observer. This evidence is contained in the behavior of Mexico's greatest shaman, Pachita. Pachita was able to materialize objects and make them disappear, demonstrating almost total control over the lattice. If the observer were the lattice itself, this control would be impossible. Somehow Pachita managed to distort the lattice until it acquired the same conformation and structure as an object, and it appeared. Presumably this behavior was the result of the characteristics of Pachita's neural field in interaction with the lattice and its voluntary management. This management is irreducible to the lattice. Therefore, the observer is not the lattice but transcends it. The observer as reality cannot be reduced to any physical model or to any explanation or thought, no matter how inclusive it may be. The observer transcends the lattice and the mind and belongs to the self. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. A big hug, and may the infinite wisdom of the Creator guide you always.